So make sure.
Oh, hold on, it's gonna fall.
Have a vote to pick history. I have a lot to say about particularly
No, it's actually on the opposite way.
history.
No, it's actually the opposite. I just.
Is everyone in?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes, but not in a few minutes.
That's okay.
I'm
Okay. Welcome to the final panel of this year's TOK Talk series at EF Academy. And we have, please introduce yourself over here.
My name is Amanda Finardi. I'm from Brazil. We won today.
Awesome. Go Brazil.
Go Brazil.
I'm Isabella Zangiara. I'm ready to say my last name. Anyway, I'm Italian and I'll be speaking.
Thank you, Isa. I'm Mr. Johnson.
I'm Prelo, I'm the RA here.
Mr. Henry.
I'm Sabrina.
Awesome. Fantastic. All right. And the last prescribed title for this year is the following. To what extent, classic TOK STEM, to what extent is the knowledge we produce determined by the methodologies we use? Right. So we've got a few key terms to definitely define right away. Those two being both determined and methodology. So I'd like to start with this key verb determined. It is a to what extent question, so we should not forget about the degrees available, and I'll ask you guys in a second where we stand in the beginning. But determined, admittedly, is quite a strong word. So we want to remember the strength of the verb, even though we're dealing with a to what extent question. So determined might mean something like the following. For it to be fully established through a series of causation, or maybe even a logical process, logical steps in an argument. This is determination. And an analogy that might be useful for us to think about is the success of a team, like the Brazilian team today, with 4 goals in the first half. So we might hear something like, the success of a team is determined by the tactics or strategy that they use. So here, the tactics or the strategy of a sports team is playing the role of methodology and academics. But this can immediately be problematized if we remember this kind of cliche we hear frequently nowadays, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Okay, so referring to this kind of larger amorphous vibe that a group has, a culture that somehow is more important than the strategy that a team uses. So that's going to be something for us to keep in mind. And then methodology, secondarily, the only other key word we need to think about is roughly a body of techniques or tools or rules that a particular AOK uses. So for today's PT, we are forced to think about history. So we've got lots of IB students that like to think about history, fantastic. But the other AOK is completely wide open. So we will have to touch upon other areas of knowledge as well. So again, methodology just refers to a body of techniques, tools, or rules that any of these AOK uses. And one final distinction that I want to put up front is the distinction between something being defined by, for example, their methodology, versus determined by methodology. So what I mean by this, the perfect example, since I have a philosophy background, the AOK of philosophy might be an example of something that is defined by its method. To do philosophy and to think about philosophy is just to use the philosophical method. It's essentially what philosophy amounts to. Whereas when we turn to our other AOKs, we might not be able to use such a clean formula. So that's the setup. And before we go into thinking more deeply about history, let's first get an initial opinion from all the panelists. So starting over here with Amanda, perhaps. So what is your answer? Remember, to what extent? So the answer could be fully agree, somewhat disagree, fully disagree. But what is your answer to the PT as it stands, Amanda?
I don't like using extreme terminology to this because as Mr. Markowitz always says, once you use the extreme, just one contract can prove you wrong. It's easy to prove it wrong. So I would say that I somewhat would agree.
Someone agree, okay,
I say somewhat as well.
okay.
I echo Amanda's fear of using extremes. I would say to almost an entirely, like a full extent, the knowledge that we have is determined by the methodology.
I guess I'd say fully, but with the caveat of not exclusively, so there's a causal path behind the domain.
I agree with this.
Okay, largely agree?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, interesting, so we've got a fair amount of consensus already, which does not always make for a great debate, but I'm sure things will get complicated as we explore the full diversity of AOKs. Okay, so zooming into history, let's kind of rethink about our PT now, just in terms of history. So to what extent is the historical knowledge, or the knowledge we produce in history as a discipline, determined by the historical methodology, the methodology of history as a discipline, which, to be clear, is kind of a field in and of itself. So that should remind us how complex this question should be. My first question to complicate matters, since we are in a consensus already, my first question would be, can we think of examples of the methods in history changing? And even if you can't think of a historical example, what would be a reason why you would want to change a method itself?
Actually, my answer to that is not actually a method changing, but to some extent the answer to a problem or a conclusion changing. Because, for example, if we talk about the beginning of the Cold War, we discussed this a lot in history, and it was actually one of our first tasks. When we faced the ways that history takes once you start studying the Cold War, because depending on the historiography way that you decide to determine as truer, if that makes any sense, you can have really different outcomes. For example, if we talk about Orthodox history, Orthodox historians tend to defend that the Cold War started because of the Soviets' actions in the Potsdam Conference, if I'm not mistaken. One of the historians that backs it up is Herbert Weiss, and actually his way of telling the story was the way chosen by the U.S. government to as a statement, an official statement. But then you have Gar Alperovitz, that a few years later comes up with his publishes a book on atomic diplomacy and brings out a different perspective, arguing that the Cold War didn't start because of the Soviets, and did start because of the drop of the atomic bombs, where he argues that instead of finishing the war, the goal of the American government was to stop the Soviet invasion and keep them from winning in the Pacific theater of the war. And you have another perspective that he would fit in revisionist history. And then you have another one that's called post-revisionist history that makes reference to the historians that had their own perspectives before, but came back to reevaluate their decisions and their conclusions once the Soviet Union had fallen. And in that sense, we have Joan Louis Gaddis. It's one of his books we actually read in history class. When he argues that it wasn't, you can't blame just one side of the story. Both sides had their own blame to a certain extent, and we can't look to history as if it was only a one-sided situation. So it's an example of not necessarily the methodologies impacting the knowledge, but the resources available that impact the way people perceive history.
Yeah.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
I totally agree with what you actually said. So do you think that our methodology in some in a certain way could be influenced by culture, as you said?
Yeah, I think not only by culture, but for your personal beliefs, it's really hard for us as people to detach ourselves from what we personally believe is right or wrong. And I think it's something that's completely related. Your point of view on a war, on a historical fact, on the use of a certain medicine, all those things are gonna be influenced by the way you behave.
And here I think it comes into play the importance of the methodologies used by the different school of thoughts. Because for example, the fact is that historians, they don't being that they're people, it's not that they're only faced with the same amount of facts. Historians have also the role about filtering the amount of information that they want to gather or not. And that comes into play when it comes to bias, or also the focal points that historians put. So the thing is, they might be, like, the thing I'm thinking about is that, since you brought up the idea of determination versus definition, I thought about that the determining factors are the same, however, given the complexity of the facts and that inevitably we have to avoid certain information, we need to sieve the information. And so I think that the thing itself, so yeah, as I said before, the determining factors are the same, however, we're using definition. So as you gave out the example of math, right? So a line segment is uniquely determined by endpoints A and B. That would be the definition part. And I think that it's interesting because it's a simplistic way rather than putting it as a infinite series of points all lined up together. Because at that point you're kind of getting lost in the complexity and determination, as we can see the whole picture, especially when it comes to Cold War, because so many things happen. And so, of course, bias are gonna come into play, but at that point, the equations are completely different. So, they're not even working on the same reference systems, they're working in different reference systems, so it's normal that they might have different outcomes. So, I mean, I just think it's important to gather both ideas.
I think looking at this example, the Cold War, would be useful for this question you say of why we might be tempted to, what reasons we'd have for changing methodologies. If you look back, let's say go 30 years back, if you were writing history of the Cold War, there would have been this pretty unanimous acceptance that the job of a historian in this situation is to try to, quote, be objective, right? My goal is to get beyond my personal limiting circumstances due to my culture or my background to try and, tell to you how it is. I think that in the historical field today, you'd be far more likely to have someone sort of aware of and broadcasting their identity as part of their telling of the history, with the idea that this goal of not being biased is actually, in a way, causing bias because it makes you seem, quote, objective, when in reality, you're just hiding your biases. It's actually much better as a historian, have your biases be out in the open. I'm an American historian, grew up in American culture, therefore, as much as I may try to be giving the sort of unbiased account, I want you as a reader to be aware of this. And the question would be, what led to a shift in thinking like this? I think it comes down to a variety of things, like assumptions, obviously, about philosophically what you're doing in history, but also goals. What is the goal of history? Is the goal of history this notion of a sort of scientific, everyone is just taking the details and putting out there and doing with it what they will? Or is it more of understanding that it is a form of hermeneutics of interpreting things, and that you should be aware of the sort of structure of interpretation of the person who's giving you information?
I would add, sorry.
Sorry. Go.
I would add to that not only, I think other factors are also important when we're talking about the shift in a methodology. So like, in history, it may have been, as you mentioned, the goal of history. So at some point for Orthodox historians, they might produce knowledge based on what the US government wanted, what the message was supposed to be conveyed. And then you have John Lewis Gaddis that changed his mind on the start of the Cold War after he got more resources, the other side of the story, as well as Soviet historians that had their own, they were kind of closed in this environment where they could only hear one side, and the other side was never discovered until the 90s. So I think I completely agree with what you just said. I think there's a lot of situations and specific knowledges that can affect in the way that we change or not methodologies.
I mean, I know you wanted to talk first, so.
So I think that the best way to evaluate these methodologies is just like to compare and contrast sources from historians that live in the century with historians that just are evaluating that fact. And as Mr. Markowitz know, I talk a lot in DTRK class about the story of my hometown, since my hometown was built entirely by Mussolini. And when I used to talk with my grandfather about this story and about Mussolini, he always said that, for example, for the South, since I came from the south of Italy, he did like good things, because he built schools, the city, the entire city, but this not means that he doesn't recognize what the bad things that Mussolini did. So I think it's really important to compare these two things and trying to extract the best as we can.
I was thinking, so about historians, I was thinking, I mean, of course, you're gonna have different biases, and that is inevitable, as we said before. But also, I was thinking about, like, that historians' main job is actually, I think, or at least if I'm not saying it wrong, I think it's just tell how history went by adding a thread, a logical thread, and so and then each of them draw their own conclusion. But I don't think one is necessarily more wrong than the other. They're just working in different systems.
I would agree. I want to go back, if I have a chance, if no one else wants to talk. I want to go back a little bit. Can you repeat the definition that we have for methodology?
So a body of techniques, tools, and rules?
Tools and rules, yeah. So we're talking about culture, and the quote was that language, or the language that you use, the culture, whatever, the tools that you use, whether you use a brush to dig up some bones or a shovel, right? That's going to alter the results of your findings, and culture is very much a part of methodology.
Yeah, that jumps right into what I was trying to say about it being I do think it's fully, but not exclusively. So the way the metaphor I see it is this, everyone in the audience here, I'm assuming grew up as a kid playing some form of games as a young child. Now, we all probably grew up depending on our culture, quite different games. However, once the game is set, the rules and the I guess strategies, all the sort of internal logic of the game, you could argue that the outcomes of that game are completely determined by the structure of the game itself. But the game that you chose to play is structured by the culture that you grew up in, right? So in a weird way, I would say, yes, the game you choose to play is kind of being given to you by your culture, but inside of that bubble where you're trying to produce outcomes, that is its own sort of internal determining
Yeah.
thing.
And earlier, Mr. Henrik, you mentioned objectivity as a goal of the historian. So the follow-up question here now for us to think about perhaps is, it seems like the good historian, if they subscribe to a school of thought like orthodox or revisionist or post-revisionist, it seems like the good historian ought to go the further step and compare, like you said, Amanda, start systematically comparing his or her results to the results of another school of thought to kind of get outside that cultural bubble. Whether or not many card-carrying historians do that is a separate question, but we're philosophers, we get to ask ought questions. So that's my next question. Ought historians, is that the second major step of the methodology of history? You find the conclusions within your own idiosyncratic cultural methodology. But then you go beyond that and you realize the myopia of that there are other schools of thought out there. And so you need to make this systematic comparison.
But isn't that like really what all historians do? Or at least like, unless you only have primary sources, most likely you're gonna gather information from other historians that are gonna have different school of thoughts than yours. So I mean, I guess the methodology is kind of the same. Like you can fit anything into your own methodology almost.
I agree to some extent, but I think there's a difference between like analyzing secondary sources and understanding that are other knowledges and actually acknowledging them and studying them. There, and in my mind, at least, I think it kind of ties into what Mr. Henrik said earlier, on what some historians, like in the present, tend to, they know that there are other points of view and perspectives, but they don't
Study them.
they don't
try to mix.
Yeah, and I think that can pose like a limitation in the process of producing knowledge, because if we don't have a full view of the pros and cons, and we compare it to the if we don't understand the situation or the event that we're studying as a whole, the knowledge that we produce from it might be compromised. It might be ultimately wrong if there's any wrong knowledge in the world. So, yeah.
But you don't need to understand. You don't need to use all the methodologies, all the different methodologies, in order to understand it, right? So if you write a paper, you do literary review, and then you show that you understand that there's like various different views on this topic.
Yeah.
But you choose one methodology, because otherwise you might as well just spend your entire life researching that and still not be enough. So you kind of have to, in a way, I think you're almost like a slave of a methodology. You have to pick one, otherwise you're just lost with the many different varieties that you have.
Yeah, and that's, Mr. Prelo, that's a nice practical constraint that's yet to be mentioned, I think. There's a certain division of labor. At the end of the day, if you're a researcher, you do kind of have to choose a method and go forward with it and turn the levers of the machine to produce knowledge. Which also makes me wonder, whether we might be misplacing, when we think about these different schools of thought and traditions, are they necessarily using different methodologies, or are they just applying different interpretive lenses to the history itself? So what I'm thinking of is the Marxist historian, they're going to be analyzing and looking at history from a social perspective, looking at class structure and class conflict. And then famously, there was a book, I guess, a few decades ago now, called The People's History, which at the time was quite revolutionary because it really focused on economic events as opposed to political events. And then you've got these traditional schools that do very much focus on key political events. So whether it's social, economic, or political, those are different schools of thought, but notice they're all applying different lenses, different interpretations to history at large. And after they're filtering, or like Isa mentioned, perhaps that's just the first step, and then they're kind of turning the same gears that the other schools do. So when we think about these different interpretive lenses, have we been correct in thinking about them having different methodologies, or is it just different filters they're bringing?
I think it's mostly different, or at least for now, and until, you know, some other people give me their points of view. I think it's kind of it's most about filtering issues. Like, for example, when, so I think that Truman was a president Yalta, and so all that he had was, Potsdam, okay. Sorry, Mr. G. Well, he was in president there, and so most of the things that he knew about communism were coming from the Riga actions that were testimonies against Soviets. And so the thing is, people having, like historians having a certain bias and following a certain methodology are of course going to be more lenient towards most like-minded people, and that's also why, like in the field, we tend to accumulate all together and find kind of the confirmation bias. So that is the real limiting factor.
I think Mr. J has found out history for its deep methodological bias, which is it's professional, right? So when we're talking about all these different lenses came out of basically the same, or are being practiced in the same space. Academic historians, right, in various subcategories within that. But if I'm a feminist historian, a Marxist historian, a big history historian, I am going to be employing basically the same methodology with maybe some slight variations on the filtering and coloring. But I would push back insofar as there are many other history practitioners who aren't working in the academy. And
Yes.
my first thought came to the way that various indigenous groups think about and conceptualize history and the practice of history. And in those situations, I would imagine one can argue that the methodology is quite different, especially in history traditions that rely almost exclusively on orality or on oral storytelling. So the first thing that came to my mind in this, and forgive me, I cannot remember which group of people do this, but there is a group of people where they remember the history of their family through song. So there's basically one person in the community who has what we call today in the West like a photographic memory, and that person would be basically in charge of taking the song that you were told once. You traveled to this person, you repeat the song that your parents taught you, they add your life onto the song, and that is the history of your lineage right here. Now, what they choose to focus on, how they narrativize that, how they interweave aspects of their cultural tradition. I mean, I would again imagine the primacy of primary source, right, might not be something that's coming up in the methodology at all.
Is that again connected to culture?
Oh, certainly, but I think that does show that there is this notion that when we think about, I think as Mr. J rightfully said, the different traditions in history, we tend to think about all of us that are descended from this academic way of doing history. But if you go outside of the academic space, to the way history is practiced in different sort of cultural traditions, then you might get into a place where the methodology is not only different, but maybe radically different. Maybe almost at odds entirely with the way it's practiced.
I wonder, it's a fantastic point, and it reminds us of the old TOK curriculum where we used to have Indigenous knowledge as a separate AOK. So great to bring that in, and I wonder if we can weave it into academic history as such. And I guess I'm thinking of the biography school of thought, which I believe tends to be most popular in the UK. And what's nice about biography studies is it's often rightfully labeled as microhistory. So there's a localness to it. In the same way, we can kind of think of indigenous culture, which is a whole people or peoples often, but still has a locality to it. So I wonder if we can still weave that into academic history at large, as long as we maintain that localness.
I have one thing I want to
Yeah.
say, because he prompted me on this.
Yeah.
I think that if we accept that there are traditional practices that maybe are comfortable with what we would think of as logical paradoxes, that's a place where I think we're immediately in danger, right? Like a Western historian is immediately going to say that Prelo and I have different experiences. I said, oh, I walked in the room at 6:01. He goes, what? I saw you at 6:05. Traditional academic historian from the West is going to say, one of these is more truthful, one of these is kind of pushing towards some reality. While I can imagine a historical practice at an indigenous tribe that would say, oh, those are both true, and that's fine. Or those paradoxes can both exist.
Yeah.
I
So
was-
last thought, and then since Mr. Henrik mentioned paradoxes, I do, unless you have a thought as well, this is a perfect transition into mathematics. But final thoughts here about history.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I was thinking about the methodologies, and since like we were talking about historians, or at least academic historians, being more isolated towards like one another and finding confirmation bias, it's also how easy it is to find knowledge. Because for example, like if you go to a library, most or even on Google, most opinions you're gonna gather are coming from academic contexts. While if it comes to like Trimble and kind of social, yes, they're not. They're gonna be a lot more harder to utilize and back up, because it's even harder to acknowledge if the knowledge gathered is so different.
Absolutely. Prelo, do you have a thought?
A couple, but
Yeah.
I'll just summarize. Yeah, no, totally what Mr. Henry just said. I definitely agree. It makes me think of Montaigne when it comes to Brazil, and he says, these Brazilians are savages, or Europeans say these Brazilians are savages. But, he relativizes the barbarism in Europe as well, and so he puts these two like congruent truths together. But yeah, I think going back to the lenses, I'm very tempted to say that lenses are just also part of methodology, because you are ultimately choosing a tool to research, and it feeds back into the machine, right? Because you produce knowledge, that knowledge is going to be the base for someone else's research from then on, and so on and so forth.
But so are you saying that with the film lenses you cannot use, like it's not gonna be the same methodology even though you're following like all the same exact steps?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm saying the lens is part of the methodology. So if you
Yeah, yeah.
have the same methodology, but a different lens, that's
Yeah,
already
yeah,
a whole
yeah.
different process.
And if we would continue to metaphorize this as I want to do, I think that you could think about this. My first thought was lenses, let's imagine a camera, right? Well, the internal machinery of the camera is the same as my first thought, but the reality is,
You sound
If
like
you-
the leader of the photo club.
Yeah.
the reality is if you have a wide angle lens or you have a telescopic lens, even though the machinery is the same, your methodology is gonna change because the way that you are now interrogating the world is gonna require you to do different things. Right, so if I wanted to do a portrait with a long lens, I gotta back way the hell up if I want to be a portrait with a wide angle, I have to move closer, it distorts features, so I have to be thoughtful of that, and it just changes this.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a great pair forward.
To kind of transition into the mathematics that Mr. J brought up, I thought about the use of a calculator in math, and how is it there's a world of difference between what we.
Ooh, nice throwback to the other.
I wrote about that.
Yeah.
There is a huge difference between using a calculator, and a phone calculator, and an actual, the scientific calculator that we use here in school. Even though, in theory, they're used for the same thing, and they have the same functions, the way that you're gonna use the scientific calculator, it's completely different than using a calculator, a phone calculator. There is, and I agree with Trello in the sense that, by using different, versions of the same invention, the methodology changes.
Yeah.
Because you need to learn how to use that methodology to be able to produce knowledge. So, and that, using that scientific calculator might lead you to a result that you would take much longer using a phone calculator, because you didn't have access to the same resources. So yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's perfect, Amanda, because one example for mathematics that I like to use in class would be 0 raised to the power of 0. And if we type that into Google's calculator, Google, I believe, still gives us the answer of undefined. But if we type it into our scientific calculator, we usually get the answer of 1. So this brings to mind, switching over to mathematics, let's ask the question all over again. To what extent is mathematical knowledge that we produce determined by the methodology we use? And what's nice about the case of mathematics is an AOK here is we can more or less cleanly substitute in for methodology here logic. And basically the same thing we saw in history, there are these different schools of thought within professional mathematics that subscribe to different foundational logics. Some of them use different logics, and some of them are religious about the logic they use. They've made that decision, like Prelog said, in every single research paper they produce, they're using that particular logic. So is our answer going to change here? So let me ask the question again, that rephrased. What's your opinion in math? Is this going to be a different answer than you gave for history? Let's start over here this time.
I don't know, because I think this has changed a lot since I came here. Because, for example, the study of math in Italy was completely different than the one I used to use here. For example, we didn't have that calculator that you use here, and we used to do all that process by our hand. So I think that also for math, the methodology that we use determine our knowledge. Because, for example, now I cannot do the stuff that I used to do in Italy by my hand anymore, because math. I mean, for me, I'm not that good in math. So if I don't practice stuff, I used to forget that.
Right.
But here, for example, I know how to do that kind of stuff really well, because I memorize all the passages on the calculator. So I think that also in math it depends on, I don't know, your country, your culture, also I don't know where you are, and yeah.
Well, that is interesting, and that links back nicely to Mr. Hendrick's talk about some cultures that are sympathetic, or at least not allergic to paradoxes, something like logical paradoxes. So that is interesting. However, we should flag this as potential debate, because it's reasonable for us to think of the cultural relativism when it comes to history. After all, we think of all the emotional investments into history. Any historian, even trying to be objective, is from a particular nation, from a particular past, and perhaps is representing a cause and a people greater than him or herself. But emotional investment in mathematics is, it's a bit more peculiar, and to represent your people sounds a bit misplaced perhaps. However, back to Mr. Hendrick's point, it does seem like some cultures are more sympathetic, or at least tolerant, of something like a logical paradox, whereas other cultures aren't. So maybe there is, so let's think about this. You said it best, Sabrina. Is there kind of this cultural relativism happening in mathematics as well as history?
Okay. No, I was thinking about, like, since we were talking about methodologies, I started thinking about the different planes we can do math on. So, like, like you can do it either, like, on a 2D dimension, or whether you can imagine it on a sphere, right? So you can use, I mean, and then, yeah, then we'll use other methodologies, and we can use the same ones. But like, if you bring it back to history and see with that point of view, I think that, yes, the methodologies are important, but on the matter of produce knowledge, it's also both about the person that is giving the knowledge and the person that's receiving it. So it depends on the plane you're working with.
So you're saying that the results is the same, but the process is different. So it depends on, I don't know, the country where you are, or culture where you come from. Is methodology would be different?
I'm not really talking about, like, you might use, like, I might show you the product, like, I might use the same methodology. However, depending on the context of where I am, it's gonna fit differently into a culture. So I might tell you the outcome, but in the way it's gonna be interpreted by people, and the way it's gonna produce knowledge is gonna fit the persons, the people that listen.
Not to get really abstract here.
I do not at all. Gosh.
So I think, seeing as it's the World Cup, I'll use this metaphor. We can imagine, as happens all around the world, that we are all born into a society where there are nets on the ground, fields, and a ball. Now, we can imagine each society having a goal. One goal, simple, get the ball in the net. And after that, it's a free-for-all, right? Each society can come up with its own rules, maneuvers, methods. We can imagine a society that highly praises and cares about efficiency, trying to have a game where it doesn't matter at all, just the fastest way of possibly getting into the net matters, right? So if it means, kicking it so that it goes, or if it's more accurate, just to run as fast as you can and hold on to it. You can imagine whole elaborate games being sprung up about how to do this and why to do this. Now, that one can think of as different methodologies, right, within mathematics, trying sort of aiming for the same goal, but getting about doing it in different ways. What I think, and this abstraction is still there, so hold on. What we would not be comfortable with, I think most people, in a society where we're all told we have to get the ball in the net, is if someone just picked up the ball and just ran in circles the whole time and then threw it out of the court. We'd say, no, you're not playing this game. There's all these different ways to play this game, right? But there is one thing you have to do. If you call this football, it's not football if you just run and throw the ball down a well, right? Which I think one could think of as the constrictions on mathematics. One can come up and imagine a game that uses the same fundamental pieces, but we go, wait, what's the point? You're not doing the goal of mathematics, which is get the ball in the net, right? You're just going in circles, nonsensical circles.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's one, it's a great metaphor, but there's one small piece that's a bit disanalogous, which is that these different schools of thought in mathematics using different logics, sometimes one can reach the goal and another can't.
Yes.
The goal is not even achievable.
Yes.
So it turns out within a certain logic, maybe one that is sympathetic to paradoxes, they can get there, but then the stricter type of logic, they can't even reach that same conclusion. So then all of a sudden it becomes a real rivalry. And that's why this makes for great philosophical debate in mathematics. It's just like, okay, it's not that they're both achieving the same conclusions, because I think earlier, a nice mini thesis we all came up with is diversity of methodologies is great, especially if we arrive at the same conclusions. Often it seems like we might have this holy grail method from above that says, okay, now you guys are on target, because you've got all these different methods all targeting the same conclusion. Hopefully that has some truth value to it. But in mathematics, you have all these different methods that only some of them can get there. But these guys who don't get there, it's not that they're impoverished or something. It's that just they are thinking differently. And we don't get it. We don't appreciate it. Because there's no, like, history is in the past. Oh, I said the first truism of the day. Yeah, okay. History happened. It's in the past. It's official. So we do want to get there. We can't, sometimes it's deep in the past and it's hard to get there. But mathematics, it's like we're headed. We
Can I-
kind of make the things we're proving along the way. Yeah.
Daisy, can I mess up the net metaphor just really quick and see if this makes more sense?
Hmm.
Instead of it being a single net, what if it was near infinite numbers of nets, including some nets that you don't even know that you kicked it into until it goes
Yeah.
against.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this probably works better, yeah.
Right, but then that still comes down to this fact that you can imagine someone who's not even going near the nets, just doing circles, right? And the point is, even though they're doing something that is using the same things that one does for this goal-oriented task,
Yeah.
it seems nonsensical. So basically, kind of what I'm trying to push here is, instead of people thinking that because these balls keep going into the net, so on, so to speak, it means that the nets have always been there and that it's not culturally determined. It's, we have these tools, we have these items. A lot of people are focused on it getting in the net, but if you're playing around with those items nonsensically, is that still not in the same field, basically? Okay.
One thing I would like to ask is that when we talk about the person running around in circles and that being seen as nonsense, does it made me think of the definition of success and how success is a very subjective concept because it means different things for different people and it means different things for different methodologies. So the question I wanted to ask is how can we how can we choose which methodology is successful or not in the way of producing knowledge not as historians or as mathematicians, but as human beings and as students and as teachers, because I think that's also important in the sense that sometimes we're not able to decide if something is successful or not because it's so intricate and so complicated. There are so many maths in there that you can't really separate one thing from another, but in other fields you can. You can call out in history what was a wrong thing that happened. We can talk about the Holocaust, we can talk about wars. Can you talk about something that was wrong in math? Like a knowledge that was produced that shouldn't have been?
Well, I guess that'd be the whole point is if it produces knowledge, right? The wrongness would be, according to some people, right? It's not producing knowledge.
Yeah.
So you imagine like a deeply logically inconsistent math system, right? Which would be the equivalent of going back to that metaphor of people just like running in circles around the ball. And then we go, okay, well, you're not getting anywhere. I mean, what's the point of this, right? It's not producing knowledge. Which again, I think gets to the point where maybe in this case, we could say that math knowledge is fully determined by the methodologies being used because math knowledge, like the knowledge itself requires putting the ball in the net in this way, but that one could do mathematics without the intent of producing knowledge in a way that's this sort of random, inconsistent, illogical.
And maybe there's a element of like conscious choice to make math, to discover something. And ultimately there's a goal. Like sometimes, it's very different from history because in history, we usually want to understand the past, to understand the present. Math, as you said, is all about the future. It's all about what's next. It is about the present too, but we don't necessarily go back in time to think, oh my God, how, we do that with the pyramids. That would be a contraclaim. But, we don't, go back in time and question the mathematical knowledge that was already established at some point. We look forward, we look to expand that knowledge and expand those methodologies too, in some sense. But I don't think that in math, there is a way of producing knowledge without those methodologies. Because to some extent, they were always there. They were created when math was created, if it was ever created. At least that's how I see it.
So, if you guys don't mind, maybe one more AOK as a halfway house between, I think we're realizing that mathematics and history as disciplines are quite well removed from each other. But smack in the middle of the two of them would be something like natural science. And back to what Amanda was saying, perhaps, I mean, success is a very difficult term to define and pin down, and especially in terms of mathematics, but something like a natural science, I think this is a field, this is an AOK where we can quite confidently pin down what it means for science to be successful. And just for the sake of our conversation, let's just say natural science is successful when we have a unified, intelligible picture of the world that's experimentally confirmed over and over and over. That's essentially the long-term goal. The nice thing about natural science too, speaking of these nice time slogans, there's no limit to science. There's no deadline. It's not like IB, right? Like we can finish physics in 1,000 years. That's okay. We need to think about global warming first. But 1,000 years from now, maybe physics is finished, and what that will mean in terms of success, I think, you guys can disagree with me, but we have a unified picture that's experimentally confirmed. So that's kind of the long-term goal of something like science. But just as the last thing to think about, quite famously in philosophy, there was one dude, Paul Feyerabend, who was he wrote a book called Against Method. And he looked at all of these historical case studies in natural science. And time again, he thought that the scientific method itself was the very thing that prevented progress. So progress to that ultimately successful goal. And he thought these things like falsification and our allergy to ad hoc hypotheses that are just not beautiful or simple, but ones we just kind of throw in because we hope or think they might work or fix things. He thought all of that was a bunch of nonsense. And he thought that subscribing to any methodology would be overly restrictive of the natural adaptive ability for science to grow and to progress. So any reactions to this kind of view in science as a halfway house between abstract math and history?
I want to potentially challenge your definition because I'm a pain in the butt.
No.
I don't know if we need to be committed to the notion of unified. Right? I would argue that there is this, not potentially, and you can all tell me what you think, necessary need for this sort of wide internal consistency. The way I have always thought of science as producing knowledge is it producing useful models that have predictive abilities. And we can imagine a situation where you have two different models with utility and prediction that seem to be internally consistent but externally inconsistent, right? You can't go back to this sort of notion of paradox, really. And as long as science is committed to that, that seems to me that it is 100% being determined by its methodology. It's saying this is what I want, this is what I expect, that my results end up in this unified, consistent theory. When we can imagine a separate scientific methodology that says, all I care about is predictive utility, these systems, these results seem to be useful in the future. I can predict if I take this assumption, these certain things, which are then useless over in this area. And then I have this one that's useful over here, but useless in this area. They seemingly both can exist as logically true at the same time. If you're a scientist that would be okay with that, I think you can imagine that being a different methodology than the assumed norm.
Yeah, like with that idea, we constantly do it. Like when it comes to just physics on Earth, right? Usually we use Newton's laws, but normally they're not coherent once you are out of Earth, and so you start using relativity. But it's a lot less practical. You need all the different whatever they're called, axioms, whatever. But so with that idea, I was thinking, wait, if it makes sense. So now it's just like a little parenthesis history, but then I can connect it again to natural sciences. And I was thinking about, what if, like, going with abstract, but making the analogy with Nazis and Holocaust, what if, in an alternative world, the Nazis were actually successful at erasing all of the proofs they had, all the proofs about Holocaust being a thing. Nothing would be tangible for the scientific method, so actually proving it, but you would have testimonies that still wouldn't be enough to exercise that method and apply it. So what about in other instances where things like in natural science cannot, we don't have the tools to measure them, or we don't have enough proof for something, but we know it exists. At that point, the second that we can say we're like pro with whatever is how you pronounce it, that the scientific method is limiting because of course certain things exist, but we just can't prove it. Like things that we take for granted all the time, and we just think, but we can't prove it, but we still use it, and that doesn't follow the scientific method. You know, so like in math, those would be axioms and stuff.
I think something that may be important to think about is that knowledge still exists, but then we will attribute some value to it, whether or not, depending on our goals, right? So the people that are running around in circles in the soccer metaphor, they're still producing some knowledge for themselves, maybe, right? But then we're the ones attributing value to that and saying, that's useless, right? And we can think of like different examples of math, like, math was mostly for engineering, back in Egypt, right? And now we use math a lot for commerce, right? Which wasn't as, much of a pressing matter back then. But so like the question of value, right? So, is this like knowledge that we're gonna use for something? Is it not? Isabella, I already forgot what you just said. Can you repeat what you just said? You also forgot. It's great, short, but same mind, same wavelength.
No, I haven't. I was talking. Maybe I haven't. Okay. My attention span just decreased after 10 minutes. Anyway, so I was saying, that sometimes you don't have enough proof.
Right. So the evidence, if the Nazis would have like erased all the evidence, we wouldn't have. Yeah, I mean, there would still be a knowledge that was passed from time to time. We just have to choose whether or not we value, the story that the testimony of the victims versus the like physical proofs that we have.
One thing that's more, I think it's an everyday, unfortunately, but that just made me think of victims, usually women that are victim of abuse or rape, that sometimes we don't have proof, and there is a choice that needs to be made whether you're gonna believe the victim or the possible aggressor. One case that specifically it was a big deal in our country was when Neymar was accused of raping a woman. And in the end, the justice understood that he didn't, because there were proof that he didn't. But if, like, as a Brazilian, as a soccer supporter, it broke my heart to see one of the guys that I have admired my entire life be accused of that.
Mm.
But I was in her side until it was proven wrong.
Mhm.
Because it was, it's harder for the victim to receive support
Mm.
than the aggressor. But still, when you have to choose between, situations like that and perspectives like that, it's not easy.
Mm.
Because you might wanna believe in one side,
Mhm.
but there are more evidence to the other side. There are tendencies, there are
Mm.
biases,
Mhm.
there are, internal beliefs and external, prejudices and certain circumstances that, can impact whether you're gonna believe on something or not. I think that's the process of learning too. Learning about a subjective thing. I think religion, the psychology of religion is a lot based on belief too. So, going back to the human sciences, there is a huge, element of trust in the studies of religion. And that is based, and it's a huge thing, but there is no proof. It depends on people and on the books, but no concrete, again, proof, I'm repeating myself. But yeah, it's interesting how beliefs and how perspective can play a role in that sense.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Henry.
Yeah, just circling back to something that really got me thinking about what you said about natural science having such a distinct sort of goal in a way that versus math. And I wonder what everyone thinks on this. To me, I feel like I would be comfortable if someone said, the point of math in my culture is to give people headaches. The more headache inducing the mathematics is, the better the math. Right? We have this assumption that math has to be directed towards some sort of consistency, logic, goal, ability to manipulate the world. You can imagine just no, the more of a headache it is, that's culturally what math is for us.
Is that culture also masochistic? Is that
Yes,
like
100%, yes.
Really into that.
Then on the other hand, I actually cannot imagine a culture in any sort of sensible sense saying the point of natural science is to get someone headache. Like, it seems to me like the methodology in and of itself includes this sort of goal in it, in a way that math doesn't necessarily, right? Like, so the basis of natural science is this notion of observing and predicting, which in a weird way, again, I guess I could imagine observing and predicting and not caring, but the whole predictive process relies on this sort of falsification process, which then kind of points towards wanting to have better and better predictive models, right? It would be a very strange and boring science if all we cared about is making predictions and then not really caring if our predictions got better. Which is, I make predictions, and, right?
That's
So it's
a huge
almost
part of academia.
yeah, it's
a huge part of
academia. Just like,
Shh, don't give it away, yeah.
So I think that does point to something interesting there within natural science that seems distinct.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you guys don't mind, just one final question, because we've got a big audience that we want to hear questions from. Large looming final philosophical thought. Now that Amanda brought up psychology, religion, and these other interdisciplinary efforts, my final question for you guys is something similar to our original CT, but to what extent can one AOK productively use the method of another AOK? Is that even possible? And if so, why and how?
Depends on the areas you
Okay.
choose.
Yeah, you want to give us an example of how you might see that happening?
So, you can't apply the scientific method in history,
Cannot.
cannot.
Okay.
Because to some extent you might be
Mm.
able to, but then there's the part of replication.
Mm.
And I think that is the part that, like, how are you gonna replicate something that's so human? I don't think there's a possibility, but
Mm.
you might be able to replicate the scientific method in that.
Mm. So let's be clear and careful here, since this is TOK. So you mean they can't use the natural scientific method, but maybe they can use the human sciences method?
Yeah.
You wanna say that? Okay, yeah.
The only thing is that like I think we, in natural sciences, we do all the time examples where we cannot actually like, have the experiment happening, right? Like there's this whole field between experimental physics and theoretical physics, right?
Mhm.
And so, I mean, I guess, not just Mr. Markowitz, he was like, no,
Unrelated, yeah.
unrelated.
He doesn't like experimental physics, yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well, in theoretical physics, there's a lot about just like giving out theories on, without needing the experimental part on it. You just use pure logic, and that's kind of what we're trying to do by making by having analytical thinking in history. But I mean, I do agree that it's not that you can apply scientific method in all history aspects, or other or at least I want to make that claim before exploring more to that side. But I was thinking, no, I forgot. So
Okay.
continue.
But come back.
I think there's certainly a two-way relationship between art and all of the other ones. I think that you can use art in each of those in terms of the sort of creative processes that go in. I think you can actually use all the other AOKs inside art as sort of, again, an interesting method within constructing art and thinking about art. The only one that I'm, I guess, struggling with right now is whether you can use the natural sciences and mathematics. If we accept mathematics and logic as being somewhat similar, which is controversial, but if we accept it as basically logical processing, then I think math works, again, every way. The one that's weird to me is if natural science is based on prediction and observation, I have a really hard time seeing how that method really works in that.
The only, I know, moderator, if you guys don't mind responding, Mr. Henrik, I can't help myself, but this came up last panel too.
Yeah.
So there are new movements in computer science, where now, thanks to computer simulation, it's almost as if we can do natural science on math itself by kind of like creating different programs and software and running them, and just kind of like seeing this data that we get, big data of all these possible mathematical results. And it's very similar to the method of natural science, but they're applying it to different purely mathematical ideas. So that's the only way I can think of.
If computational science is already like based on math, you're just like using you're just feeding it back into itself, the information back into itself.
Well, but it's
Because you don't have the random the random variables that you would have in real life. Like how would they come into effect if you're programming it into the program so the program can predict.
right. I guess the difference is really just comes down to the screen, because like Mr. Henrik highlighted, the only difference between mathematics and natural sciences is it seems like we've got to observe something out there. It's like now all of a sudden we've got something here, just kind of like out there. But you're right, Fredo, it's just spitting back more math to us, which we programmed into it anyways. But there is this kind of unpredictable.
Well, because what you're talking about is something beyond. Even though the system's set up by us, the actual calculating processes are so advanced that they're actually not within our math understandable world. So basically, you could imagine a system that is using mathematics, producing for unknowable reasons results, and then you are based on that process doing prediction and observation and going. I think and again, beyond the realm of human cognition, the process of generating this, based on what we've seen so far from these generative processes, the next one will be like this. Oh, I'm wrong, well, we're trying to come up with almost like a law of, I back it, I'm wrong. It's the nerdiest thing we've talked about.
Stephen Wolfram, for IB students, want to look at this.
Oh, yeah.
Wolfram is the guy
Alpha,
behind all
Wolfram
this,
is
Prelo, or?
I think that only math and history cannot be connected. Otherwise, I'm thinking, for example, about human science and history could be connected to material, and also human science and natural science.
Mm.
I don't have an example right now,
Mm.
but
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think they could be connected.
I mean,
But it seems like we're all seeing, there's a bit of consensus here, that we all see the possibility, there's nothing too problematic about it, taking, just extracting a method from AOK and applying it to another.
But I mean, I do see like Sabrina's point of view about like natural science not always like fitting in history,
Mm.
but also because history or at least human sciences, they have lots of more like outcomes that we wouldn't even think of, right? So natural science is a lot about predicting the most probable outcome,
Mm.
but there's a lot of like variables that you don't even consider. So like I don't know, someone drinks a glass of water and most probably think they're gonna be more hydrated. The other one, they're gonna spit it out with their lungs, you know? But you're not just taking into consideration the fact that the guy might be spitting out their entire lung out, you know? But that's part of history. Just like you can get close.
Yeah.
You can approximate and play with the probabilities, but it's kind of the same thing with babies.
I agree with Elena because as I see history, I think that I compare history with math could be too much limiting it, yeah. Because math, I mean, because history has a lot of more process and a lot of more thinking, and you need to evaluate a lot of stuff going on, and also a lot of points, as we said, a lot of historian points. Instead of with math, it's just like, is the answer, that's it,
Mm.
you know,
Did
so.
I hear you, there's more thinking going on in history?
Yeah.
I think a lot of mathematicians online just got very angry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean.
Yeah, no, I'm just joking. Any final thoughts before we turn it over to our audience?
Just
Yeah.
for, Mr. Henry actually brought up the arts. The perfect example of that is that the methodology in arts
Mm.
sometimes includes, depending on the type of art that you're creating,
Mm.
it strongly depends on other AOKs.
Mhm.
I'm writing my math IA on the correlation between music and math.
Mm.
And if you look at it, music is math completely. And I say this as someone that I wish it wasn't.
That's music to my ears, I love that.
But, and not only in music, if you're, I'm not really an artistic person in the sense of painting or producing physical art. But I know from my little knowledge in the area that sometimes you can use formulas and certain diagrams and mathematical knowledge in general and use it to the arts, and you need to apply it. Like the axis of like perfection or something like that. That's math and art at the same place and mixed and intertwined.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And I mean, I like thinking about methodologies with the purpose of not following them. So the cool thing about arts is that, I mean, of course, we do have criteria with which we're grading art. So like that comes out with value, composition, and those are all things that are kind of is like either intertwining us as like biologically and understanding like proportions, as you might explain with the Fibonacci sequence. However, the cool thing about or at least with visual arts, which I'm sure is in other arts as well, is about creating something disturbing that's completely out of the methodology that we usually use to build something harmonious. So the fact is that the moment you decide to completely avoid a certain field of thought, you're kind of working with the methodology, but you know, like antimatter.
Someone, okay, special TOK trivia, someone later for homework, look on Wikipedia for the name of that phenomenon that Isa just mentioned. Like the last thing you want to study is the next thing you need in your research. There's a name for that. It's a Wikipedia page. Find it and you get bonus points. Awesome. Can we end on that note? Okay. Thank you for your patience, audience. Questions for the panelists? Hopefully there are many, because there are many audience members. Oh, Art.
So, the arts as area of knowledge remained somewhat unexplored in your discussion. What I'm the most curious about, would you consider the resource used to produce the art piece, so the knowledge in this AOK, so like whether you use pastel, oil, or spray paint, would it define the knowledge, and would you consider this to be the methodology in art?
So yeah, surprising that they've come up with the raw materials behind the art itself.
I 100% think that within, it becomes hard. My natural thing, of course, the material is the methodology, but is that the methodology of the AOK of art? I think that's a real deep question, right? Because I think you can think of the methodology of the AOK of art as maybe being something as abstract as humans modifying some sort of physical thing, or creating a conceptual space, whatever it may be. Yeah, I think actually thinking it out with the AOK of art is probably distinct from the material.
I think as far as art goes, like producing the physical, like, you know, art process, the process of creating art, yeah, you have the method, which is however you choose, you know, the tools, if you choose to paint, if you choose to sculpt or whatever. And then not only, because art is very much about eliciting an emotional response, I think the interpretation then becomes the knowledge, right, that you want, or that's the final product, I think. So that would be the interpretation, then you would use that. So, you know, if we're talking about the Mona Lisa, right, however, you know, methods that went into like painting the Mona Lisa, then, you know, the what you feel once you look at it, and if you feel that it's like the most beautiful, most perfect, most mathematically, you know, genuine piece of art that could have been produced, that will go back, that will feed back into the machine as, you know, the previous knowledge that you had as to how to produce the best possible work of art, right? And then like factor into the methodology that you use now to produce further, you know, new like pieces of art. So I think the interpretation then becomes the knowledge.
Other questions? Mr. Barton?
Yeah, so when I looked at this question, to what extent the knowledge we produce determined by the methodologies we use, my main thought was, what else would it be? And the other thing it would be facts of the world. And I wondered if I could put the question to the panel. Most of you said fully. So then what room is there for evidence discovered by scientists or historians to influence the knowledge we produce? It makes it sound like the methodologies are completely creating the world. And that's extremely postmodern. It may be where you all want to be, but what room is there for evidence in your way of seeing the world?
I mean, I was thinking about methodologies being part, like, no, facts being part of the methodologies themselves used, right? So, because if I'm saying one thing, like, facts separated by themselves, they're not, like, they're just the tools, but without having the environment to interact with, right? So, like, you might have a shovel, it's a shovel. But with the methodologies and with the logical sense and with the way you're showing how to use it, then you're going out to produce something, a theory that's gonna more or less be close to the truth, right? But while if it's facts separated by itself, or just like a series of facts, but without being logically threaded by the use of methodology, then it's not really producing any knowledge. You don't have the tool, you don't have the shovel to use. build your reality.
As you may have guessed, I support what you said. The postmodern view, 100%.
Oh, you support the postmodern?
Oh yeah, when I say it's fully, I mean, yeah, fully. 100%,
Fully.
Yeah.
Fully.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it changed, I'm fully.
Yeah, if we're talking about fact as you know, piece of truth, and you know, going back to you guys, okay, you know, an element of trust, so an element of emotion, literal emotion being needed in order to accept truth. It's not that we're constructing a new world, but we're reflecting a world, and you know, yeah, that's all we can do, you know, as far as like reaching truth.
There's a bit of a paradox in Mr. Barton's question too, if you think about it. The facts are often knowledge we've already produced. And so there's a little bit of an infinite regress here, you know, unless there's the original Adam and Eve facts that we start with. But in any AOK, it usually keeps going back. So, nice question, nonetheless. Other
Question.
any voices out there? We don't want to exclude anyone. No?
I think they want to exclude food from
Yeah.
energy and get.
Yeah, yeah. Let's do one more question, guys. The internet's got time, right, internet? Yeah.
If you ask one more question, I'll do a TikTok dance.
Well, there we go. Now we get an incentive.
Please ask a
Incentivize.
question. I would if I could.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
No, not you.
Ooh. Oh. David, I know you got a question.
What?
I know you do.
I-
I know
yeah.
you do. You're our in-house philosopher. Ask away.
My gig.
I don't know, you were just so concise.
Oh, we don't want compliments. Yeah. Yeah, all right.
I'll ask a quick one.
Yeah, Ms. Quick. Yeah.
Quick one.
On behalf of everyone, thank Mr. Marcus.
So I've
Yeah.
never read this guy, Fire Abba,
Yeah.
but
wait.
what is this? You can imagine historians changing methodologies in the middle of their career. I can't imagine a historian teaching the scientific method mid-career and still being a scientist. So like, what is the,
Oh, you said a historian, you mean a scientist?
Scientist.
teaching the scientific method? Yeah. So what, in his case studies, he highlights a lot of historical examples. Like I have Galileo written down here, with heliocentrism. And there was a big debate in the history of science between what do we trust to? What do we trust more, the unaided eye or a telescope? Back to photography examples too, and like this. And this comes up time and time again, just like Mr. Henry reference. It's like sometimes we get these new technologies, which later on in retrospect we realize how amazing they are, and they actually help our scientific efforts. But at the time, they give us this distancing from the sensory apparatus that we're used to. And so it took a lot of persuasive effort for them to realize that I think it was like the extra brightness of Mars or something. It couldn't be accounted for in the heliocentric view based on how we see it with unaided eyes. But through the telescope, it ended up being justifiable. And so, I mean, what Feyerabend does in all his case studies is back to paradoxes too. He notices these inconsistencies in the framework. And whereas we're usually allergic to it, and you don't want to throw in ad hoc hypotheses, because that's not part of the official method, he says we should be all for it, because looking back, those were precisely the things that did allow us to move into heliocentrism.
And also he-
Building off the curve.
And then
Way, yeah.
he also talks about conforming to the standard. So that means that you exclusively use that without, being holistic. So for example, like now you can talk about like the huge difference, or at least discussion
Yeah.
between DOs and MDs and medicine, like in practicing medicine, right?
Yeah.
And the fact is that DOs, they do recommend you some like holistic type of views that are like maybe closer to non-Western methods in practicing medicine that are not supported by specific evidence, but that have seen still betterments in patients that might be or might not be placebo, but it still does not follow the scientific method. or at least doesn't contradict the others.
Cool. All right. On that note, we'll officially wrap it up. Thanks again. Dinner time. Thank you. It's a little. Sorry to think I knew.
Almost, you should have asked the question.
You
Because
did.
you came in.
Yeah, I was so sure
And I tricked it.
Okay.
5 and I'm
Sorry, I
Yeah,
almost
they
came
were.
in late.
No, I had a lot of parts here,
Thanks for coming,
because
guys.
I'm just, as you can
I
see,
didn't
writing
check
stuff
it.
down.
You did?
I see what he did,
What is
like
that?
I was constantly
Oh.
doing that.
Yeah, talk.
Oh, so these are,
So,
So,
there was a lot of
The
drawings.
mind
and
weird.
that.
There was a student across that gestures
Have my brain
about
first.
like trying to leave.
oh, yeah, yeah.
It had nothing to do with you,
Yeah.
but I didn't want to attempt to explain.
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
No, no, no,
Fine.
nothing, nothing to do. But it was just the way, I was sitting
Fine.
here, he was sitting there.
Thank you
I did a gesture, so you probably like,
Yeah.
and I was like,
Yeah.
no.
A lot more to.
That's what that was.
Oh my goodness. Can I say something? It's so wrong.
Oh, right, no, yeah. But also experimental physics, yeah. That's,
And so many examples in Brazil, like just related to Brazil.
Oh, I didn't have any examples.
I just
I
like, we
came
were
up
talking
with
about,
today,
Charlie,
my
you were
father
saying
and
something.
I were missing
Thank you.
this morning.
good as
always.
Thank
And
you.
I was just saying, I was like, I wanna see what's going on if I don't prepare for this guy.
Yeah.
yeah. Oh, are we
It
still,
wasn't bad.
Very conversant with post-revisionists and Marxists and all that.
Well,
Yeah,
this
I
is
took
from
the
Brazil.
notes actually about